Growing up as a kid, I was introduced to each unique genre of games by a specific title. Need for Speed Underground 2 introduced me to racing games. Grand Theft Auto Vice City to open world games, and the original Half-Life introduced me to first-person shooter games. There is one game, however, that when I played it got me immediately hooked on RPG games. This game was different and unlike anything I had ever played before. The top-down view of the world and the dark and unsettling atmosphere and art style, coupled with all the little sounds in the game's soundtrack, were all setting me up for an adventure the likes of which I had never before experienced in my whole life. It's a game that came out 20 years ago, and it's still being played today. It's being kept alive by an incredibly passionate community of speedrunners, modders, and just people who can't get enough of it. It's a game with more or less limitless replayability that can be just as unforgiving as it is fun. It's one of those games which has stood the test of time and is so special to so many people. A game which just the mere mention of its name is enough to get a nostalgic reaction from most people who have played it. And if you haven't played it, you've definitely heard of it before. It captured the imagination of so many kids and teenagers who spent countless hours in this gothic fantasy world. And to this day, I am willing to say that it is the best that not just the game series is from, but the genre as a whole has had to offer. So without further ado, stay a while and listen, because I'm here to talk about how it felt to play Diablo 2. I really wanted to make this video because I strongly believe that Diablo 2 is one of the best games ever made. And I know that a lot of people have played it either when they were young or when they were growing up, but then they stopped for one reason or another. And I think that no matter how many more years older this game gets, it will still hold up because it's probably one of the games with the best replayability factor out there. The nostalgia alone makes it worth it to replay this game if you haven't in a while. And I know that this is valid for a lot of older games, but this is especially valid for Diablo 2 in my opinion. It's a game from a long gone era, where games didn't hold your hand every step of the way. It's a game where you had to figure out a lot of things by yourself, where making a small mistake in how you develop your character could hinder your entire playthrough down the line, and your skill point allocations had weight to them and a feeling of permanence, something that isn't present in Diablo 3. Diablo 2 as a whole is an old school classic, a game which doesn't hide the fact that it's old. I mean, the resolution is 800 by 600, come on now. But it's really impressive what they managed to achieve with the 2D graphics in the game. The art style is one of my favorites to this day, and you get used to the look of the game surprisingly quickly. It still does a lot of things better than its modern day counterparts, and in this video I'll try and cover some of the little aspects of the game that have stuck with me after all these years, ranging from the gameplay to the story, setting, and sound design. I'll also try and talk about all the little standout moments in the game that I had when I played it when I was young. So sit back, get comfortable, and let's begin. I want to talk about Diablo 2's story first. But before I can do that, I need to cover something which is one of the most iconic parts of the whole game. Starting the game up, the main menu music immediately hits you, and it's a mix of a lot of things. It feels foreboding, dark, but also epic as well. It manages to perfectly get you in the mood to start up a new character and play through this whole game for the 100th time. And this main menu soundtrack playing over the character select screen managed to fill little me up with so much excitement to play that no other game has quite managed to achieve this. The amazing part is that I was excited without even playing a single second of the game. I was completely ready and immersed into the world. And this is achieved by the now iconic campfire character select. Having each one of the playable classes do their little animation was a great way to portray what playing those classes would be like. From the barbarian roaring at you with his axe and the assassin's martial arts kick, seeing all of the classes step forward and do their signature move was the coolest thing for little me. I remember cycling through them one by one, imagining what playing them in the game would be like. And a small side note here is the fact that in the Diablo 4 demos that they showed, they had a little nod to this now iconic character select screen, and just seeing the campfire made me really happy. But nevertheless, choosing a name for my character was a big problem for me back then. Nowadays I don't really care and I just kinda pick something goofy, but back then I wanted my character's name to sound cool and heroic, which meant the character selection could take a while. Having selected a character, the game loads and you find yourself in the rogue encampment. No armor, no skills, just you and your weapon. A fresh start and a clean slate. Countless opportunities are ahead of you, from what weapon you use, to what gear to aim for, and what build to go for. Those of you who have played the game know this feeling and how amazing it is. Talking to Arif and Akara in my initial playthroughs, I would listen to what they have to say, paying attention to all the little story details and everything. But as you get more familiar with the game and when you start trying out new classes and builds, everyone skips these conversations. The story of the game follows that of the first Diablo game, and it basically boils down to you catching up to the mysterious Dark Wanderer and a man called Marius who follows him. and this is all presented through some amazingly crafted cutscenes at the end of each act in the game. These cutscenes show their journey east, with Marius narrating over them. And I know this isn't anything new to the people who have played this game countless of times, but I just wanted to comment on the superb execution of the cutscenes. From the voice acting to the way they're directed, it's all top notch, and it shows that even 20 years ago, Blizzard were still at the top of their game when it comes to producing a cinematic storytelling experience. And as a child in my first playthrough, I was always so hyped when I would finish each one of the 5 acts in the game, because I knew that the cinematic was coming. It made heading down and defeating some of the lesser and prime evils at the end of each act feel that bit more rewarding. And the story, with its twists and revelations presented through these cutscenes, were mind-blowing for me back then. And don't worry, I won't spoil anything in this review for the one person who hasn't played this game. The next topic I want to cover is the game's setting and atmosphere. You head out into the wilderness, that is the Bloodmoor, and your ears are greeted with yet another iconic soundtrack. These initial sections of the game are one of the most memorable moments that it has to offer, and this is because for a lot of people that played this game when they were young, they were captivated by all the little sounds and experiences that the game presents. And this of course isn't to say that the later parts of the game are memorable. On the contrary, it's just that for a lot of people, myself included, the first act of the game is probably the most iconic one. And doing the game's first quest and clearing out the Den of Evil feels so exciting because it's your first step in this long journey that is this game. And it felt really annoying missing that one little monster in the cave and then having to run around like a crazy person hunting it down. The game's events and story take place in the fictional world of Sanctuary, and there also exist the realms of Heaven and Hell, which are in an eternal conflict. The game's environments vary drastically both in layout and overall aesthetic from act to act. From the rainy and dark, typically European medieval Act 1, to the desert surrounding Ludgolain in Act 2, and the deep, Mayan-inspired jungles of Korost in Act 3, concluding with the Hell-inspired Act 4 and the mountainous and frigid Act 5. The game switches up the environments just as you get used to the one you're currently in and are ready to move on. It manages to nail the aesthetic and feel of each act's location perfectly, and the difference in layout made it feel new and refreshing. And while I'm on the topic of layouts, the majority of the unique little areas within each act had waypoints in them. And as a kid, I would not move on to the next area, and act for that matter, until I had found every single one of these waypoints. It's something that I do to this very day, and it's easy enough in Act 1, which I would argue has the most standard areas. And that makes sense because you start there. Then moving on to the double-tiered Act 2, and the rivers of the Korost jungle that produce branching paths in Act 2 and 3 respectively, finding these waypoints could become a bit of a chore. And as you're running around trying to find them, sometimes you find the waypoints right off the bat, but sometimes you just barely miss it, and you don't even realize, and you have to backtrack and you just end up feeling irritated. What makes this worse is the fact that Diablo 2 has stamina, and this mechanic I can wholeheartedly say can be removed entirely. Having my stamina run out and being forced to walk was just a pain in the ass, and even David Brevik, one of the creators of the game, says it's something he will change if he could. It becomes entirely pointless after you gain some levels, and it's just annoying in the early game. And going back to the topic of the game's aesthetic again, an aspect of it that might be a bit underappreciated is the art style of the items themselves. As a kid, every time I would get a newer and better piece of armor, I would make sure I'm finished with all the fighting before I equipped it. I did this because your character model changes when you switch the armor that you're wearing. You can't see the actual armor itself, but the armoring on your character itself changes, if that makes sense. And seeing that change really made me connect to the character I was playing. It's a great way of visually showing how tougher and more badass you become. And looking at the items you have in your inventory, larger items like armors and shields will take up way more slots than a dagger, for example. And this isn't the case in Diablo 3, but it has its pros and cons. In Diablo 3 you can definitely fit way more gear in your inventory, but in Diablo 2 you had to kinda play this game of inventory Tetris, as Mr. Llama SC calls it. Some people hate it, and I can see why. It's annoying having to jumble all your items about to make them all fit, but it also feels really satisfying when you manage to pull it off. And in addition to that, you got to fully appreciate the actual item art styles. Diablo 2 has some of my favorite looking items in any video game, and all the gothic armors and plate mails just look really cool. They all manage to further sell you on the idea that you're in these medieval but also magical times, without it being over the top with massive pauldrons and needlessly pointy weapons and armors. It's classy, clean, but also unmistakably fantasy medieval. Additionally, the game immerses you in the world by allowing you to talk to the NPCs. And by today's standards, it's not revolutionary by any stretch of the imagination. But when I played this game as a kid, I would just love to go and talk to each one of the NPCs. I wouldn't skip any of the conversations in my initial playthroughs. I was fully absorbed into the world, and I wanted to know more about the game's story and lore. And each character has a gossip option, where you can get some more information on either events happening in the world or on other NPC characters in the city. It's entirely optional, but I would always do it just to hear what stories they had, and it's a nice little break from all the fighting that you do in the game. And moreover, you got to talk to the NPCs about the quest you're currently doing or have just completed, and it just adds this extra bit of spiciness to your achievements. Hearing what the NPCs think of what you've done acts like a little ego boost. Coming back to a previous act city just to hear the NPC's unique voice lines was a really cool surprise for little me. And all of this just proves how much detail you can have in a game that's 20 years old, and just how all the little things add so much to the world building.
Hello again. Things have been very quiet around here since you left.
Diablo 2 follows a pretty simple formula at first glance when it comes to the general gameplay and combat. Click somewhere to move, click on something to hit it, or on an NPC to talk to them, and click at something with your other mouse button to cast a spell. You have your potions bar, and that's pretty much all you need in a combat scenario. The simplicity of this formula is what makes the gameplay so nice, and all the animations are crisp and quick. Hitting something and killing it with one blow with the Barbarian, just as you exit the rogue encampment, feels so nice, and this is because your hits feel like they have weight to them. And the quickness of it all just makes the combat something you get used to quickly, but something that can take a while to master. And what I mean by mastering combat is more so related to your actual game sense. What I mean by that is knowing which fights to take and which not to. And this is because in Diablo 2 you can't just run into every boss spec you see and expect to win each fight. You need to look at the elite champion's attributes, such as extra fast, spectral hit, and so on, and then you decide if you want to fight it or not. Being overly confident in Diablo 2 can result in you getting killed pretty quickly. Getting hit once or twice and seeing more than 2/3 of your health just disappear can get your heart racing, and you start just chugging a lot of your potions. And the fact that you can drink like 8 potions in a row is kind of a telltale sign that this is an older game. I remember as a kid when I would fight on Dario or any other boss, I would always open up a teleport so I can just jump in it when things would get messy. I would run to Akara, stock up on potions, and go fight again. Rinse and repeat. That was my way of dealing with bosses. And it felt horrible realizing that you don't have a potion on your belt hotkeys. This meant having to open up your inventory, which takes up half the screen by the way, and trying to quickly find the potion to drink it. Those moments in the game, in my opinion, are as stressful as it gets. As you get more proficient in combat, you learn which skills to use when and where to stand, so you don't take a lot of damage. You know which fights you can and should take, which ones you can potentially take, and which ones you definitely cannot. You perfect all the countless runs that you do for items, until they get so efficient that you're in and out in those boss fights in a matter of seconds. The easier ones that is, like Mephisto for example. The gameplay in this game is simple and robust enough, whilst also not restricting the player with convoluted systems. If you maxed out a skill, you know that it's going to do damage, unlike Diablo 3 where damage is directly based on your weapon, or based on a multiplier on an item. In Diablo 2, hitting something with your weapon is your last ditch effort if you're a caster. You won't see a necromancer running around with a two-handed axe, for example. The gameplay in this game, much like a lot of other things in it, has stood the test of time, and is one of its defining features which keeps bringing back the game's hardcore fans after all these years. Moving on to the topic of progression, the way Diablo 2 does its progression in my opinion feels both rewarding and fair at the same time. I want to cover item drops first. Starting the game, the majority of your initial items will either be white items or socketed items, and this is to be expected, but getting the occasional blue item feels really nice, and fighting a yellow item feels amazing. And this is because of the way the game balances these items. If you get skill rolls on a blue item, they can roll up to +3 for a specific skill, but on a yellow item, you get lower rolls, but you get extra attributes. So you have to do the mental math yourself and decide if you want to drop the item or equip it. And the game provides all these items somewhat sparingly. As you move through the game, you're predominantly getting white, grey, and blue items, with yellows being the kind of special ones. And this means that getting a unique or set item feels even more rewarding, because the drop chance for those is much lower in comparison. I want to make a little comparison here. Playing a Nephilim Rift in Diablo 3 on Torment 16 will show you how much these games differ, as in that game a yellow or blue item is totally worthless in the endgame, and it gets smelted for resources right away, and in the meantime you get bombarded with legendaries and set items. In Diablo 2 on the other hand, you can find a use for some of these yellow and blue items even later on in the game. When playing Diablo 2, I remember constantly listening out for the drop of either a ring or an amulet, because those would sell for a lot of gold in the early game, and I needed as much of that gold as possible to go to Geed and gamble for items. And gambling for items is also part of the game which I loved to do as a kid, and as a matter of fact I still enjoy it to this day. Getting a magical yellow item chainmail or ringmail in Act 1 on normal on my first try felt amazing, and it was an easy way to gear out your character early on in the game if you were lucky. And that's why gearing out your character can feel a bit tedious but also rewarding at the same time, because all the items and runes are a lot more rare. I remember doing countless Countess runs just to get this one rune which I needed for my rune word, and finally getting it felt so satisfying, because the game can really make you work for some things. The game also makes you think when it comes to skill selection. I remember back in the day my initial playthroughs were with a melee summoner necromancer, and I would run around hitting things alongside my skeletons and the game felt hard, because I was using the class in a way which doesn't really allow it to fully show its potential. At that time I didn't see the game being beatable without having a skeleton army fighting alongside me. I thought that every class was gonna be just as weak as a melee necromancer. And when I finally managed to get to Nightmare after beating the game in normal, I had skill and stat points scattered everywhere, low resistances to elements across the board, and it dawned on me that this character was more or less dead in the water. The game makes you take the decision of what build you're playing pretty early on, because your choices have weight to them. And sure, you have a small number of character resets available to you, but you still need to be really careful with your skill tree path and stat allocations. Gameplay like this, one which can be unforgiving, doesn't really see much implementation nowadays. It's a bygone element in video games, but the people who grew up playing this game really do appreciate its hardcore nature in regards to some aspects. Diablo 2 is easily my favorite Diablo game. It expanded on everything the first Diablo game had and added so much more. It's a game that embraces the dark gothic art style, and the atmosphere that the game has is nothing short of spectacular. Diablo 2 has limitless replayability, both in terms of map layouts and just the sheer number of ways you can go about playing this game. From what skill build to go for, to what items to aim for in the late game, and everything in between, this game never fails to give you a unique experience with the same toolkit. An experience that always feels fresh, fun and exciting, while also feeling familiar at the same time. And each character feels unique and equally powerful and fun to play as. Diablo 2 stays true to its bleak and gritty art style, which is further enhanced by the phenomenal and now iconic soundtrack that this game has. And in this review I've merely scratched the surface of it all, but I wanted to keep it relatively short, and I know that there are many more aspects to this game that I didn't cover. For me, this game is equally fun today as it was all these years ago, and in a way, I've grown to appreciate it even more. In my opinion, Diablo 2 is the best game that the series and genre have come up with, and it rightfully serves as the game against which a lot of the newer ones in the genre are compared.